Hello everybody, my name is Cole Wymore, and today my presentation will focus on firearm presence and storage in Iowa FFA members' homes. Suicides account for 2/3 of all firearm deaths in the United States. Across all suicide attempts not involving a gun, only 4% will result in the death. However, approximately 90% of firearm suicide attempts end in death. Youth suicides are a national tragedy. The firearm suicide rate in children and teens has increased 65% in the past 10 years. Suicide has become the second leading cause of death for those 10 to 16 years old. In 2017, about half of youth suicides involved a firearm. Studies have shown higher teen suicide rates in states where more people own guns. 43% of completed teen suicides are carried out with firearms. Suicide by firearm is the most common successful method used by males, and the second most common for females. Suicide rates with a firearm are almost 2 times higher among rural than urban residents. The more rural a region in the United States is, the higher their suicide rate. The graph below shows suicide rates per 100,000 by level of county urbanization from the years 1999 to 2015. The top two lines represent rural regions, while the bottom two lines represent urban regions. As we can see, all regions across the United States have seen an increase in suicide rate. Yet, in recent years, we can see that the difference between urban and rural suicide rates has dramatically increased. The single biggest risk factor for suicide is access to a gun. Research has shown having access to a firearm triples one's risk of death by suicide. Children and teens are very impulsive, and quick and easy access to a lethal means of killing themselves puts them at a particular risk. Preventing access to a lethal means of suicide is a major objective in preventing suicides among those at risk. More than 3/4 of unintentional shootings occur in homes. In most cases, the person who pulled the trigger is a minor. A 2014 study of fatal and non-fatal pediatric firearm injuries found that in a third of the cases, victims shot themselves. In approximately half of the cases, victims were shot by a friend or family member. In 68% of the cases, the firearm used was owned by a family member. Firearms being safely secured is associated with a reduction of unintentional shootings in children, even after adjusting for firearm prevalence. A case control study showed youth living in homes with safer firearm storage had lower risks of both self-inflicted and unintentional firearm-related injuries. The objective of this study was to determine firearm exposure and storage practices in homes of rural youth. Attendees of the 2019 Iowa FFA Leadership Conference were surveyed at the University of Iowa Stead Family Children's Hospital safety booth. Data was collected regarding the presence of firearms in the home and their storage. Demographic data obtained included age, sex, race, and where the FFA member lived. Descriptive and comparative analysis were performed. The results: 1,382 FFA members completed the survey. Their ages ranged from 13 to 18 years old. In regards to where they lived, just over half lived on a farm, just under a fifth lived in the country but not on a farm, and 29% lived in town. Participants were asked a series of questions regarding the presence of firearms in their home. 84% of those surveyed said that there was a rifle or shotgun where they lived. 58% of those surveyed said that there was a handgun where they lived. Over half of participants had both rifles or shotguns and handguns at their house. The proportion of homes with firearms varied significantly by where FFA members lived. FFA members living on farms had a significantly higher proportion of firearms in the home for rifles and shotguns and for handguns. 91% of those living on a farm, over 4/5 of those living in the country but not on a farm, and 70% of those living in town had rifles or shotguns in their home. Over 3/5 of those living on a farm, 57% of those living in the country but not on a farm, and 50% of those living in town had a handgun in their home. Furthermore, Caucasians had a significantly higher proportion with rifles or shotguns in their home compared to that of other races. Of those with rifles or shotguns in their home, 29% stated that they were stored loaded, over half stated that they were stored unlocked, and just under 1/5 stated that they were stored both unlocked and loaded at least some of the time. For those who reported that there were rifles or shotguns unlocked at least part of the time in their home, almost half also had ammunition that was stored unlocked. When comparing properly stored firearms to where FFA members lived, those living on farms had significantly higher proportions of improperly stored firearms compared to FFA members living in the country but not on a farm. Those living in the country but not on a farm also had significantly higher proportions of improperly stored firearms compared to those living in town. Of those with handguns in their home, 40% said they were stored loaded. Over 2/5 stated they were stored unlocked, and about a quarter reported they were stored both unlocked and loaded at least some of the time. 53% of participants stated their handguns were never stored loaded, 50% stated they were never stored unlocked, and just over 2/3 stated that they were never stored loaded and unlocked. For those who reported there were handguns unlocked at least part of the time in their home, 38% also had ammunition that was stored unlocked. Of those who are aware of how both rifles or shotguns and handguns were stored in the home, just over 4/5 reported that they had at least one firearm stored either unlocked or loaded at least some of the time. In conclusion, the vast majority of Iowa FFA members have firearms in their home, and a large proportion of them are not stored safely. This puts these adolescents at an increased risk for firearm-related suicide. Widespread efforts are needed to educate rural families regarding the importance of proper storage of firearms and ammunition.